Fire Bear Redemption, Not Happening on My Shift, by Joy McNeil. Stacy placed the impact wrench on the ground and started to remove the lug nuts from the hub of the old Chevy pickup she was working on. She sighed deeply as the tire came free, and she casually rolled it over to the wheel stand. Logan lifted his head out from under the hood of the Mazda and looked in Stacy's direction. "It's 1:15, Stacy. Are you hungry yet?" "I've got to fix this here tire before Clinton gets back from the bank. You know how scratchy he gets if the work ain't done on time. He fired young Broody Watson the other day for being 10 minutes late for work. He's just as likely to hold off paying this bill if I don't replace this worn tire by the time he's done fixing his business in town. That darn guy doesn't know when to quit with the attitude. He actually makes me look like a nice boss." "You are a nice boss, Stacy. However, I'd be lying if I didn't say that when I first started working for you, I was a little scared of you," Logan said, grinning broadly. "All I ever want is folks to respect me. I guess the little bit of that ornery Texan blood pulsing through these veins has had more effect on me than I ever realized." "Ah, well, now you've said that, I understand," Logan replied, looking thoughtfully at Stacy. "You had better not be mocking me, mister," she answered abruptly, staring over at him with narrowed eyes. "Sorry, no, Stacy, not at all. Perhaps I should explain myself." Logan closed the hood of the car he was working on and walked over to where Stacy was standing with her hands on her hips, looking rather bemused. "Well, in the past year that I've worked here, I have always wondered about the slight southern accent you have. I know you've lived in Alberta most of your life, so I couldn't figure out how it came about. I'm sorry, I guess I've never had the gumption to ask you about it till today." "Oh, I see. Well, that is okay then." Stacy turned and swung the tire up over the stand as she carried on speaking. "The answer is simple, really. My ma was American, born and raised in Houston, Texas. That is where she met my pa. He worked for a Canadian oil company and was transferred to Houston for a time. Ma was a waitress at the local bar when they met. When she became pregnant with me, Pa convinced her to marry him and move up to Canada. I was born here, but with Ma's strong southern accent, I guess it was easy for me to pick it up. I think she said Pa got used to saying things with a southern drawl at times, too." "You were quite right about that. When I picked your Pa up hitchhiking, there was no doubt he had a bit of southern drawl in there somewhere." After saying this, he remained quiet for a time. He was lost in thought, remembering her father's passing that fateful day. Logan still felt bad for giving the box of matches to Mr. Summers, which inadvertently caused the old man's death. However, he wanted to know more about Stacy's past, so he didn't dwell on it for too long before asking the next question. "So I guess I shouldn't be asking this, Stacy, but how come your mom didn't return to Texas when she left your pa?" "She fell in love with a cowboy at the Calgary Stampede. Kind of ironic, don't you think? I guess Bob reminded her of her life growing up in Texas. Anyways, he married her as soon as she divorced Pa, and they were together for the next 14 years. That was until a bull rolled on Bob at the rodeo and killed him. I reckon Ma died of a broken heart right alongside him that day. It was not long after that she was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and she passed in the following spring," Stacy stated solemnly as she jimmied the tire from the rim and started replacing it with a shiny new one. "Sorry, Stacy, that must have been hard on you," Logan replied with a sigh. "Well, at least that answers your question, doesn't it? I can't believe you have waited all this time for me to tell you that I'm part American. I have never bothered to look up my Texan relatives. They kind of disowned Ma when she moved to Canada. Anyways, it is all in the past. I need to hurry up and balance and fit this tire so we can get a bite to eat before Clinton gets here." No sooner was the job done, and the pair had just sat down to tuck into a pepperoni pizza, than Clinton stormed into the workshop looking rather hot under the collar. He strode up to his pickup truck, opened the passenger door, and roughly threw the folder he had tucked under his arm onto the passenger's seat. He slammed the door closed with such force that the impact wrench fell off the wooden crate it was resting on and landed on the concrete floor with a resounding ping. "Can't pay you today, Stacy," he yelled out across the workshop as he made his way around to the driver's door. "That lousy bank manager has just screwed my balls to the wall." Stacy stood up from the table and was just about to tell Clinton that it was okay. She'd hold the bill until the 20th of the following month, However, before she managed to get the words out of her mouth, Clinton unexpectedly collapsed onto the workshop floor. The pair of mechanics wasted no time reaching his side, and while Logan bent down to check if Clinton was breathing and felt for a pulse, Stacy was on her mobile phone to the 911 operator. "He is in arrest," Logan said abruptly as he ripped open Clinton's shirt and began chest compressions. Even before Stacy had hung up from the operator, the pair's pagers began beeping loudly in their trouser pockets. "Guess this is one call we don't have to race to the fire hall for," Stacy remarked as she ran to the end of the workshop and grabbed the first aid kit. From it, she took out a face shield and returned to kneel next to Clinton's head. The pair of volunteer firefighters had acted out this technique so many times that the scene now playing out in front of them seemed routine. As Logan said, 29, 30, aloud, Stacy leaned over their patient and blew 2 deep breaths into Clinton's lungs. Her eyes watched his chest rise as air filled his lungs. As soon as she had finished, Logan started the second round of 30 compressions. It didn't take long for them to hear sirens coming from down the street, and soon the rescue truck pulled up abruptly in front of the workshop doors. This was closely followed by the EMS unit. Almost like clockwork, while Logan carried on counting his compressions, Brad, the medic, started working around him. He placed the electrode pads on Clinton's chest, while Adam, the EMT, inserted the oropharyngeal airway and placed a bag mask over the patient's face. Once the leads were attached to the defibrillator, Brad asked Logan to stop the compressions so he could see what rhythm Clinton's heart was reading on the monitor. "He's in VF, ready to shock. Stand clear," Brad announced loudly. Everyone stood back, and Clinton jerked suddenly as the electrical current ran through his body. "Recommence CPR," the medic asked as he grabbed an IV lure and quickly found a vein in the patient's arm. Once this was done, he told everyone to stand clear again. This time, after the shock was administered, a sinus rhythm flicked up on the defibrillator screen. "Right, let's get him loaded into the hospital," Brad stated loudly, amongst the sighs of relief coming from the others standing around their patient. Once Clinton was loaded into the ambulance and it drove off under lights, Stacy walked over and picked up the impact wrench off the floor. It had been a tense 10 minutes, and with adrenaline still pumping through her veins, she threw the object into the toolkit with a loud clunk. "You think we saved him?" Stacy asked, swinging around to face Logan. "He's not out of the woods yet, but yeah, I think we may have given him a fighting chance at least," he answered with a faint smile. Just then the phone rang. It was Mrs. Jacobs, and she wanted Stacy to come around to her place with the car trailer as soon as she was able to. "I'll come around now, Mrs. Jacobs. I need some fresh air." "So your timing couldn't be better," the mechanic answered, not willing to iterate what she was meaning. The sun shone brightly in the early afternoon, and although there had been warnings of an approaching thunderstorm, Stacy saw nothing but blue skies in every direction. Mrs. Jacobs was on her porch shelling peas when Stacy pulled up in front of her small house. It had been several years since Mr. Jacobs had passed on, and without a handyman about the place to fix it, the place was starting to look a little run down. This, however, seemed to have no effect on the old lady, as she greeted Stacy with a large smile on her face. "Good timing, Stacy. I was just about to go put the kettle on and make some coffee. I bought some of my favorite coffee beans from Tim Hortons the other day, and I've been waiting for a visitor to call by so I can open the packet." 12 minutes later, the two women sat on the veranda, sipping on the freshly brewed coffee and tucking into home-baked muffins. Mrs. Jacobs had yet to tell Stacy what was wrong with her Oldsmobile, that it warranted the need of a car trailer. Stacy had only serviced it the month before, and it seemed to be running very well at that time, but the car seemed to be the last thing on the old lady's mind while she told Stacy about the upcoming country fair. It was always an event high on Mrs. Jacobs' priorities, and she had been on the organizing committee for many years. In the end, Stacy had to almost butt in to ask the question about the car. She didn't want to seem rude, but time was getting on, and she was already feeling guilty for leaving Logan with all the work at the garage. "Oh, yes, of course, Stacy, the car. I was speaking to Mrs. Thompson at the meeting the other day. She has the best crop of tomatoes I've seen in ages. I think she will win the grand prize for the best tomato relish this year." Stacy smiled weakly at the old woman with a puzzled look on her face. She didn't want to seem rude, but she was wondering if Mrs. Jacobs was starting to go nuts. Anyways, the old woman continued, seemingly oblivious to the look upon Stacy's face, Mrs. Thompson was telling me about the kind deed you did for her son Steve, giving him that Mustang. And it got me thinking about my Stan. God rest his soul. I miss him so much, she said with a deep sigh. Stacy reached forward and handed Mrs. Jacobs a tissue from her shirt pocket so that the old lady could dry the tears from her eyes. I'm just a silly old fool, Stacy, but enough of this blubbering. Come with me, she asked, standing from the wicker chair. Stacy followed Mrs. Jacobs out to the barn at the back of the house. Several chickens ran squawking from the doorway as they entered the barn, and the smell of stale hay hit Stacy's nose instantly. Yet none of this seemed to bother her as she stared over at the dust cover which was hiding the distinct shape of a car beneath it. Mrs. Jacobs walked over to it and slowly began to pull off the cover. This was Stan's pride and joy. I just couldn't bear to look at it after his passing, but I think it's very unfair of me to hide it away any longer. As the cover slipped to the ground at the back of the vehicle, Stacy stood there with her mouth ajar. There, in the light from the doorway, stood the best example of an almost factory original 1965 Ford Mustang Shelby GT350 that Stacy had ever seen. In fact, she had only ever seen one of this model before, which lay rusting in a field just outside of Medicine Hat. It is a beautiful car, Mrs. Jacobs, Stacy said as she ran her hand along the white paintwork with blue racing stripes. Are you wanting me to take it back to the garage and have it serviced for you? You can do with it what you please, other than sell it, Stacy, because I am gifting it to you, the old lady replied with a broad smile. Oh, no, I couldn't do that, Mrs. Jacobs, Stacy protested, shaking her head back and forth and hurriedly withdrawing her hand from the car. Now, there, my dear, it wouldn't be very fitting of you not to oblige me after you did the same deed for Steve Thompson, now would it? I insist that you take the car. I will never drive it, and I have no family to leave it to once I have gone. I want you to have it, and I'd also be very pleased if you were to drive it in the parade on Fair Day. Stan used to do so for many years, until he got too sick to drive anymore. Stacy replied, almost speechless. She looked outside across the yard at the house, and then turned back to face Mrs. Jacobs. I will take the car on one condition, and one condition only. That is, if you will allow me to gather a few workers, and we fix up the broken spouting, and give your house a new coat of paint. Mrs. Jacobs looked into Stacy's eyes with a twinkle in her own. You have yourself a deal, Stacy, she answered resoundingly. Logan was very impressed when Stacy returned to work with the Mustang in tow, and said he was more than happy to help her paint Mrs. Jacobs' house. Stacy was reluctant to turn the key on the Mustang until she had time to give it a full service. However, as soon as this was done, the second she turned the key in the ignition, the old girl fired into life with the distinct rumble of a 289 V8 engine. Stacy signaled Logan to hop in the passenger seat, and they cruised out onto the open highway. You know what? Stacy said over the rumble of the engine. I think I have changed my mind. Are you going to return the car to Mrs. Jacobs? Logan asked in a surprised voice. Are you crazy? Stacy replied with a slight laugh. No way. What I was going to say is, as much as I love the Mach 2 Mustang, I think I like this old girl better. With that said, she put her foot down, and they took off like a rocket. Sadly, this was short-lived because the sheriff had just pulled out from a lay-by ahead of them, and he quickly swung his cruiser around with the lights and siren going. Damn it, Stacy swore as she pulled the Mustang over and waited for the sheriff to catch them up. Morning, Stacy. Are you in a bit of a hurry? I clocked you at 149 kilometers. Can I see your license, registration, and insurance, please? The sheriff asked with a stern look on his face. Of course. Sorry, Rowan. I was forgetting this old girl has miles per hour on the speedo and not kilometers, Stacy replied with a faint smile as she handed him the paperwork. The expression on his face didn't look at all convinced as he took the paperwork back to his cruiser. He soon returned with Stacy's stuff and a freshly printed speeding infringement. Please bear in mind that the speed limit is 100 kilometers on our highways. That is 62 miles per hour on your Speedo. Stacy, enjoy the rest of your day. Hang on a minute, said Stacy quickly as Rowan turned to walk away. Are you working Saturday week, Rowan? If not, we are making a volunteer work crew to paint Mrs. Jacobs' house, and we sure could use your help. I am sure I can make myself available, Rowan answered with a smile. Anything for Mrs. Jacobs. I'm going to have to join the gym soon if she doesn't stop leaving pies at the station. The following Saturday, true to his word, Rowan, along with several of the firefighters, joined Logan and Stacy to spend a productive day at Mrs. Jacobs. With copious amounts of freshly brewed coffee, lemonade, and homemade baking on offer, the tired-looking house had transformed by the end of the afternoon. Mrs. Jacobs, of course, was very grateful and insisted that everyone took the leftover goodies before they departed the house. Summer was very hot and dry on the prairie that year. Grass fires were an increasing problem for the fire department, and everyone was looking forward to some rain. However, as the old saying goes, be careful what you wish for, was to ring true, because after an extremely hot morning, there were dark and rather threatening clouds forming in the west. Stacy had asked Logan to take the tow truck and pick up a tractor from one of the farms 30 kilometers west of town. They both looked up at the darkened, angry skies as Logan jumped into the driver's seat. Hopefully that weather holds off until you get back, Logan. I heard them giving out tornado warnings on the radio a while ago, Stacy said with a worried expression. I'll be fine. See you in a bit, Logan replied casually. He drove off, heading straight towards the approaching storm, and Stacy went back into the workshop to carry on working on the car she had up on the hydraulic lift. It didn't take too long for the sound of thunder to roll along the landscape, and as it grew louder, Stacy went to stand outside the workshop doors and look toward the west. Just then, a voice crackled on the radio with an urgent warning. A tornado has touched down to the west of Claire's home. Stacy didn't wait to hear any more. She jumped into the Mustang and made off down the road as the rain started to pelt down heavily on the windshield. She didn't know why she was endangering herself. Logan was no fool. But something deep down inside her seemed to take hold of her, and she had an ominous feeling that he was in danger. The rain seemed relentless as it poured out of the sky with such force that even the windscreen wipers going at full speed couldn't cope, and Stacy could barely make out the road. Thankfully, unlike herself, most people had decided to remain off the highway that afternoon. The lightning flashed nonstop overhead, adding to the distraction of driving. Yet Stacy kept going, heading in the direction Logan had taken earlier. Then by some sheer luck, and not much else, Stacy noticed some headlights in the ditch to her left. She pulled up as close as she dared and raced over towards the other vehicle, and she noticed it was indeed the tow truck. As she drew closer, she realized the ditch was filling fast with water. It was already up to the top of the wheel rims on the truck. Stacy jumped down into the cold water and waded over to the driver's door. Logan was conscious with his head back, and he looked to be in a good deal of pain. Stacy grappled with the door handle, but it wouldn't open. "Logan, open your window," Stacy called to him, knocking on it frantically to get his attention. He turned his head to face her, but made no attempt to do as she had asked. Stacy waded back through the water, which seemed to be getting deeper by the minute. She headed back to the Mustang, where she knew she had a crowbar in the trunk. She would have to use it to try and jimmy the door open or smash the window. At the same time, Stacy dialed 911 on her cell phone. Whatever she did, she knew she needed some help fast. With the crowbar in hand and help on the way, Stacy jumped back into the water and tried frantically to open the driver's door. It just wouldn't budge. In the end, she smashed the window and cleared the glass out of the way. "Logan, you have to get out of here," she yelled at him as she tugged on his shirt. As if a light suddenly switched on in his brain, Logan finally answered her. "I can't move, Stacy. My foot is pinned under the brake pedal." "You're going to have to try, Logan. The cab is filling up with water," Stacy replied in a raised voice. The water had seeped under the door and was now lapping around Logan's legs. He tried to move his foot and winced in pain as it refused to budge. While this was happening, Stacy was weighing up in her head how far out of town she had driven and how long it would take the crew to get to the fire hall, put on their gear, and arrive at the crash site. Added to this equation was the fact it was still pouring down with rain, and the ditch was getting deeper by the minute. Stacy knew it would only be a matter of time for the water to possibly be above Logan's head, given the truck's roof lay level with the top of the ditch. There was nothing for it. Stacy told Logan she'd be back in a minute, and she practically swam away from the truck and crawled up the bank heading towards her car. She popped open the hood of the Mustang and detached the longest piece of rubber tubing she could see from the engine. She was so grateful that she had the old car, because everything was just that much more accessible to reach compared to a modern vehicle. At least now, if Logan couldn't be moved from the truck until he was cut free, Stacy had a way to ensure he could still breathe should the water level go above his nose and mouth. Once more, she took to the cold water, and managing to get a foothold on the running board, Stacy attached one end of the tubing to the truck's CB aerial, and she handed the other end to Logan, who nodded in acknowledgement when he realized what she was doing. The water was still rising rapidly and was now up to his chest. It was then that they could hear the faint sounds of sirens in the distance over the pouring rain. Stacy was now very worried. She knew there was no way they would be able to use the cutting gear under the water. The only way to free Logan would be to first pull the truck up out of the ditch and then cut him free. It would take more precious time to phone for a tow truck now, and she could only think of one other option left open to them. Stacy swam to the back of the tow truck and released the winch cable, which she took in her hands and pulled up the bank out of the water. There was only one thing left to do. The rescue truck would have to be used to pull the tow truck out. By the time Stacy got back to Logan, the water had risen to his neck, and he was also starting to shiver, which is never a good sign, because it looked as though he was starting to go into shock. "You stick with me, Logan Wells," Stacy almost shouted at him. "We haven't come this far for you to give up on me now. And well, I love you, damn it." Logan stared into her eyes with a look of surprise in his, and gave a faint smile as he lifted up his hand and placed the rubber tube over his mouth and covered his nose, while the water rapidly covered his face. Stacy turned around to the sound of the fire truck pulling up on the road. She moved quickly towards them, dragging the winch cable with her. This was the first time in Stacy's life that she didn't feel in full control of her surroundings. Deep down inside, she knew she couldn't cope if Logan didn't make it. She had been fooling herself for some time now about her feelings towards her apprentice, but now she realized that he meant more to her than anybody else, and she wasn't going to lose him, at least not like this. Stacy didn't really give the captain a chance to say anything as she securely attached the winch rope to the front of the rescue truck and jumped into the driver's seat. "Can someone move the Mustang out of the way fast?" she shouted to the stunned crew. "I must pull this truck out of the ditch now, or Logan isn't going to make it. This is not happening on my shift." Once the Mustang was out of the way, Stacy placed the gear shift into reverse and slowly and carefully pulled backwards while the rope took up the slack, and slowly but surely the tow truck started to move up out of the ditch. Once it was safely back on the highway, everyone moved quickly to extract Logan from the vehicle. EMS had also arrived, and the medics soon had IV fluids running and Logan warming up beneath a space blanket. "He's going to be okay," Brad said to Stacy as he closed the door of the ambulance. Just as Stacy was about to get in her car and follow the ambulance to the hospital, the captain strolled up to her. "I think I know how Logan ended up in this ditch," he said to her, pointing his arm out across the landscape. On both sides of the highway, everything had been flattened. It appeared by all accounts that Logan had been blown into the ditch by the tornado that had touched down there. Stacy nodded in acknowledgement to the captain. "Thanks for cleaning up there, Captain. I need to get to the hospital," she stated as the Mustang fired into life. Stacy stood in the waiting room of the emergency room, having just finished her second cup of coffee, when the nurse signaled that she could go through to see Logan. He was sitting up in bed and looked a lot better color than when she had last laid eyes on him. "You all good, Logan?" she asked, not really knowing what else to say. "I will be, if you remind me of those last words you said to me," he replied with a cheeky grin. "It was a heat-of-the-moment thing, Logan. I was just being silly," she answered as she felt her cheeks reddening. "That's a shame, because I was about to tell you the same thing." However, it was a bit hard to reply with a mouthful of water, though. She looked at him blankly for a second, trying to register what he had just said. "Well, if that's the case, Logan Wells, you are fired as my apprentice. I don't want the town thinking I sleep with my staff." Logan's face dropped as if she had just hit him over the head with an ice hockey stick. Stacy suddenly grinned and gave Logan a gentle punch to his shoulder. "Let me finish," she carried on speaking. "However, as my partner in the workshop and personal life, you've got the job. Just a shame it took this scare for me to realize it. But yes, I do love you, Logan Wells, and will never stop loving you until the day I die." Several days later, Logan and Stanley were leaving the hospital when Clinton came walking up the stairs. He looked the picture of health after his brush with death and seemed most intent on thanking the pair for saving his life. "We are pleased that we were there at the right time," Stacy said, smiling at him. "I'm also glad we ran into you, Clinton, because you are one of the people Logan and I would like to invite to our engagement party next month." Clinton stood there for a moment in silence, clenching his hand to his chest. "No, I'm just joking," he said, pulling his hand forward to shake both of theirs. "Congratulations to the both of you. I'd be most honored to attend." Once he had gone through the hospital doors, Logan turned to Stacy and said, "Are you certain you want to go through with this?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Logan. Now hurry up and get into the car before I make you walk home on those crutches." The end.